Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for the Subcontracting Plan Compliance webinar, What Large and Small Contractors Need to Know. My name is John Williams. I'm a partner with PilieroMazza's Government Contracts Group, and I'm joined today by my colleague Katie Flood, who's also in our Government Contracts Group. As some of you may know, PilieroMazza is a law firm located in Washington, D.C. The slide that's now coming up on your screens will give you some more information about our firm and how you can learn about our different practice areas and the types of information that we're putting out, like today's webinar and our newsletters. And we do appreciate everybody joining us today. And one area that Katie and I have been working with a lot more recently is subcontracting plans. We've been getting involved with clients who need to build internal compliance programs and clients who need to respond to SBA audits related to subcontracting plans, and we've also seen this issue come up in some bid protests that we've worked on recently. So that was the brainchild for today's webinar, was for Katie and I to share our experiences. What are we seeing that is happening in SBA audits? What are some do's and don'ts, to be better prepared for those audits and have a more robust compliance program in general. So we want to share those experiences with you today. And we also want to get your feedback. We have a good cross-section of attendees today from large businesses, from small businesses, and from the SBA. So we encourage everybody to use the question chat box to submit questions throughout the presentation as we move through the agenda that you're seeing here on the current slide. And we'd also like to get your comments if you agree or disagree with something we've said, and let us know if we can share the comment with the group. I mean, our hope is to have a dialogue as much as we can in the webinar format, so that we all leave the presentation with a better understanding of subcontracting plan compliance and how that impacts both large and small businesses. And where we're going to go today is first with an overview of the subcontracting plan requirements. And as part of that discussion, we'll talk about what's relevant for small businesses, because a lot of the presentation today is going to be geared towards large businesses, because subcontracting plans apply to large businesses but not small businesses. But there are regulations relevant for small businesses, and if you're a small business, you may hope to not be small forever, and once you're large, this will be even more relevant for you. We'll walk you through the SBA review process when they come in and do an audit of subcontracting plan performance, and we'll end with some best practices for a successful subcontracting program. And with as much time as we have left, we'll answer your questions. So like I said, please fire away. And if we can't get to any questions today, we will follow up with you by email afterwards. So don't hesitate to ask questions. And the slides are already available on our website, so you'll be able to go to PilieroMazza.com to download the slides, and you'll also get an email after the presentation's over with a link, and that'll include the audio as well. So we'll have you covered if you want to refer back to this material afterwards. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie to start with the overview.
Hi, good afternoon. So we're starting with the subcontracting plan requirements. And the first issue where we look is, where do you find these provisions? Where in the regulations can you find what requirements are necessary for your contracts and what you need to put in? First, in the FAR, you find it in subpart 19.7, and this is where contracting officers and agencies get their directions to implement and enforce the subcontracting plan provisions. In this subsection, subpart 19.7, also provides the required clauses that agencies must include in contracts. And those are the two FAR clauses that are listed right there. FAR 52.219-8, which is utilization of small business concerns, and FAR 52.219-9, small business subcontracting plan. In addition to the requirements that are found in the FAR, SBA also has specific rules on subcontracting plan requirements, and these are found in 13 CFR 125.3, the SBA's rules. And SBA's rules in the FAR, although they should be read consistently, we see that there are a few places in the rules where there might be different requirements or different ways of stating the same kind of elements. SBA's rules are generally more frequently revised than the FAR clauses are, so you see a little bit more of specifications in the SBA's rules. SBA is the agency that is in the position of monitoring compliance, so you'll see a lot of specific requirements in the SBA's rules of what they like to see when they go through and monitor and audit your subcontracting plan requirements. And usually we see the FAR catch up to the SBA, but right now, as we said before, there's a little bit of gaps between the regulations.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point that Katie's making that we're going to come back to at several points throughout the presentation, that there are differences and gaps between the SBA rules and the FAR. And the SBA is in the position of monitoring and evaluating performance, but it's really the contracting officer that's in the position of enforcing the subcontracting plan. And so there's an interesting dichotomy there then of how SBA might view the requirements and seek to monitor and evaluate them versus what's actually in your contract with the government and what is the contracting officer going to enforce. So we're going to come back to that point a few times.
So the next slide deals with who are these requirements applicable to and when do they apply. There are some exceptions to the subcontracting plan requirements. For example, subcontracting plans and providing for maximum practical opportunities for small businesses don't apply for contracts where there's no subcontracting opportunities, or personal services contracts, or contracts performed outside the U.S. and outlying areas. So right off the outset, those are your exceptions of when these clauses apply in your contracts. But for the first clause, FAR 52219-8, you have to provide maximum practical opportunities for small businesses to participate on the subcontracting level in your prime contracts. And this will apply to most prime contracts. And it also applies to small business prime contractors, so across the board, large and small businesses. And this provision must be flowed down to subcontractors when the subcontract offers lower tier subcontracting opportunities. So separate and apart from providing maximum practical opportunities for small businesses is the requirement for the subcontracting plan. And this applies to prime contractors that prime contracts that offer subcontracting possibilities greater than $650,000 or $1.5 million for construction. And those dollar limits apply for options and modifications to the contracts as well. The subcontracting plan requirement applies only to large businesses, so it's not applicable to set-aside contracts, and it must be flowed down to subcontracts meeting those same dollar thresholds. But except for subcontracts to small businesses and subcontracts for commercial items. And then we have a little bit of thought about what is a commercial item. You need to figure that out at the outset of what you're going to be dealing with there.
Yeah, and we'll come back to this when we get to the best practices. And we actually have a question, perfect timing on your question related to flow down for commercial plans. You're not required to flow down the subcontracting plan requirements to subcontracts for commercial items. So, if you have a commercial plan as a prime contractor, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything you're subcontracting for is a commercial item. So it's not the fact that you have a commercial plan that says you don't flow down. It's what are you acquiring from your subcontractor, and if it's a commercial item, you don't flow it down. And the question is, well, who determines whether it's a commercial item? And in the best practices section, I'll preview it for you now. we suggest that you get a representation in your subcontract or your purchase order with your supplier. Have them tell you that what they're supplying to you meets the definition of a commercial item. And if they're making that representation to you, then we think you can rely in good faith on that, and you would not have to flow the subcontracting plan requirement down to them.
So next in the overview, we want to talk briefly about what is a subcontracting plan. Well, it's a plan entered into between the prime contractor and the government, and it establishes the contractor's subcontract spending goals for the different types of small businesses. So it's a separate document that will become a material part of your contract. And both the FAR and the SBA guidelines have separate required elements for a subcontracting plan, and there's 11 required elements, and these are going to be what the government looks for in your specific plan. And keep in mind that when you enter into these subcontracting plans, even though there's model templates that the SBA provides, you can negotiate these provisions to a certain degree. So we're going to be speaking about that a little bit more in the best practices section, but you want to make sure that you enter into a subcontracting plan at the outset that's going to be realistic and feasible for your company to achieve, and also meets all the required elements of the plan. So very briefly, the 11 elements are: you have to set subcontracting spending goals based on the total planned subcontracting dollars expressed as a percentage of your total planned subcontracting and as total dollars to be subcontracted. And these have to be separate goals for each type of small business. So for example, you have to set these goals for small businesses in general, small disadvantaged businesses, women-owned small businesses, hub zone, etc. So you need to make sure that the plan includes at least separate goals for each small business. And they don't have to be necessarily the goals that the agency recommends. This is where you get into a little bit of negotiation with the government on what's feasible in your industry. The second element is the types of supplies or services to be subcontracted, just a short description of what you think will be applicable for your contracts. You have to list the methodology used to develop your goals, as well as the methodology used to identify potential small business subcontractors, and an explanation of whether or how indirect costs are going to be included. And a note on that one, you are required to include indirect costs for your commercial plans, but we'll talk a little bit more later about what goes into the indirect dollar base and how you develop the plan on what gets included. Additionally, we have you have to designate a responsible officer responsible for administrating the plan, and usually they're designated as the small business liaison officer. You have to describe the efforts the company will take to ensure the small businesses have equitable opportunity to compete. You have to provide assurances that the required provisions will flow down through all subcontracts. But as John said before, it doesn't necessarily apply to all subcontracts, such as commercial item contracts. So you want to make sure when you're developing these separate elements of your plan that you're being compliant and not just flowing down all the clauses willy-nilly, that you're actually only doing what is required. You also need to provide assurances that reporting will be completed, assurances that the offeror will cooperate in any studies or surveys that the government asks them to participate in, a description of your record-keeping procedures, and steps to make good faith effort to comply with plan. So we're generally, there's 3 types of subcontracting plans. We're going to briefly outline the requirements of each. First, the one that you might be most familiar with is the individual subcontracting plan, and this is the plan that you will enter into that's specific to a single government contract, and it will cover that entire contracting period, including the options, and the goals will be based on the offeror's planned subcontracting in support of that contract, and that will be those goals can be negotiable. So you'll enter all the required elements that I just listed. Those will all be included for that specific contract. A master plan is if you are a contractor that performs multiple government contracts and you know that you have a basic subcontracting plan and methodology in place for your company, and you know that you you have all those elements already worked out, and so you're basically going to be able to take that plan and apply it across your various contracts. It's a boilerplate plan, and you can apply it to just a specific corporation, plant, or division, or basically a subset of your company. And the master subcontracting plan will be effective 3 years after approved. And the only part that differs from contract to contract is that you negotiate the goals for each separate contract individually for those contracts. It'll incorporate all the other provisions for each plan that you enter, each contract that you enter into. And the master plan will cover the entire life of the contract when adopted for that contract. Next, we're talking about the commercial plan, and this plan applies when you have for companies selling commercial items. The contractor will basically adopt an annual plan for the entire federal government, and it's not contract specific, and it's tied to the contractor's fiscal year. The plan will be limited to specific company divisions or business units, and you can use all of the contractor's subcontracting, not just that in support of the government contracts. So basically it allows the contractor to monitor their subcontracting compliance over their broad base, not just for specific contracts. The government also requires contractors to report their subcontracting plan achievements on an annual basis. It's reported through the electronic subcontracting reporting system, and it's all online. Individual subcontracting plans have to report on twice annually, and they use Standard Form 294, and commercial subcontracting plans report once annually on Standard Form 295. And you might be asking why. Why do we have to do all of these? Why do we have to do all these required elements? Basically, Congress has determined that the small business subcontracting plan requirements are an important tool to promote the government's objective of maximizing small business participation in federal procurements. So it's from the top down. It's coming from Congress. And also individual agencies also have their own small business participation goals that they want to meet, and subcontracting is a useful way for them to meet those goals. Stakes are very high for noncompliance. The government can find that you've breached your contract if you're not hitting your small business plan goals, subcontracting plan goals. As we said before, these plans become a material part of your contract. So if you are not hitting your goals, the government can say that you are breaching your contract. If you don't hit these goals, that can also be part and seen as adverse past performance. This can be reported on your CPARS evaluations and later come up as part of source selection considerations, such as agencies can look at your historical performance on subcontracting plans as part of an evaluation factor, as well as evaluating your individual subcontracting plans for that specific procurement. There's also the possibility for liquidated damages. You'll see the liquidated damages clause incorporated into your prime contract at FAR 52-219-16. We think that these liquidated damages, it's possible that they'll be imposed, although it's fairly rare. And it's when the contractor fails to make a good faith effort to comply with its plan, such as in a willful or an intentional failure to comply with the goals that they set out. And the government will look at the totality of the contractor's actions in this assessment. And liquidated damages can be fairly steep. It can be the amount equal to the dollar amount by which the contractor failed to achieve each subcontracting goal.
So the next slide here that's going to pop up just really drives home the point that Katie was just making about the real-world ramifications of subcontract plan compliance. You know, how this pops up in bid protests in a variety of ways, and we've given just a few examples here, including one from just last month. You know, you can see that in these cases the failure to meet the subcontracting plan requirement was on a prior contract was upheld as a basis to exclude an offeror from a competitive range. So they got kicked out of the competitive range because of poor subcontracting plan performance, and GAO said that's okay. That was a proper decision on the part of the agency. You can get a lower evaluation score, and it could also be an offensive protest ground to say, I shouldn't have lost to that company because they shouldn't have received a satisfactory rating for their subcontracting plan. If you have a basis to allege that they haven't performed well on their subcontracting plan, that's an offensive argument you could use in a bid protest context. Conversely, from the negative, on the positive, if you've done very well with your subcontracting plan, that can be a key factor in an award to you. So a lot of real-world ramifications for complying with the subcontracting plan. And Katie mentioned that the imposition of liquidated damages is rare, and we got a question, well, have we ever seen it? And no, the answer is no. We've never seen liquidated damages imposed on a subcontracting plan. So I think we say rare because we assume it's happened, but we have not actually seen that happen. So we've been talking about the basic requirements, and these are geared towards other than small businesses, but there are provisions that in the subcontracting plan rules that are designed for small businesses, and including some that are designed to help small businesses, and that's what we've got on this slide here. That in 2013, the SBA's rules were amended to add some provisions that require the prime contractor to notify the contracting officer if they're not using a subcontractor that they had proposed to use, or if they're behind on payments, or if they're reducing payments to small businesses. And these provisions also give the small business subcontractor the ability to go directly to the contracting officer to voice these concerns. So particularly that last point, giving the small business the ability to go directly to the contracting officer, I think that is beneficial for the small business subcontractor, because we hear that a lot, that the small business subcontractor, they're signed up to be on a team and help out a plan, and then they don't get out of the deal what they thought they were going to get out of the deal. And I think SBA heard those concerns and built these provisions into the rules a couple years ago. The interesting thing about these rules, though, and as we talked about at the outset, these are in the SBA's rules. So this isn't in the FAR. So this isn't going to be, at least not at this point, so this isn't going to be a contractual obligation for the prime contractor. And while the rule says the prime contractor shall notify the contracting officer, beyond that requirement to notify, it's unclear what mechanisms the rule provides for enforcement of that. The SBA rule goes on to state that the contracting officer's responsibility is to evaluate the report from the prime contractor, but it doesn't say what the what the contracting officer is supposed to do once it's evaluated that report. So I think it's, in theory, these are beneficial provisions, and I think the ability, like I said, to contact the CO directly is helpful, but there is some question about the practical effect of these rules, depending on how the prime contractor or contracting officer chooses to apply them. Some other provisions that are relevant for small businesses on the next slide here, if you have to recertify yourself as a large business in the midst of a set-aside contract. So let's say you were small when you won a set-aside contract, but in the midst of that contract you go through an acquisition, and as a result of that acquisition it triggers the size recertification requirement, and when you recertify your size you're no longer small. At that point it's possible the contracting officer could require you to enter into a a subcontracting plan for the remaining portion of the contract. So that's an example of where, as a small business, you may be thinking, well, I'm not clear on how important all these requirements are to me, but at some point you may no longer be a small business, and it may be that it happens even midstream on a contract that was awarded to you as a small business. The second bullet point here, I don't think a lot of people know this. I mean, certainly the SBA folks on the phone know this, but you can protest the size or status of a subcontractor on a subcontracting plan. So if you're a small business and you're a competitor for a subcontract, and you think that you lost the subcontract to a firm that's not truly small or not truly SDVOSB or what have you, you can protest. And likewise, the prime contractor, if it's not sure on the status of the company that it's awarding the subcontract to, could, in theory, I don't know how often the prime would do this in practice, but they could protest, and as could the SBA or the contracting officer. And those types of protests will be handled just like any other size protests or status protests at the SBA. I think it's very seldom utilized. We looked and couldn't find an example in reported decisions where there was a really clear example of it. I know I've done a lot of size protests over the years and status protests, but I've never done one on a subcontract. It's always been at the prime contract level, but that this is something else that's out there. And then for the last couple years, we've had the presumed loss rule at the SBA, which really heightens the need to be accurate when you're representing your size and status as a small business. There are more penalties. There's more exposure now when you sign that or fill out that representation that says I'm small or I'm woman-owned. You need to make sure it's accurate, and that increased burden and penalties applies at the subcontract level. So when you make a representation to the prime contractor that you are small, you face additional potential penalties under SBA's presumed loss rule. And then we have another more recent rulemaking that's popping up on your screen here. When the SBA issued their proposed rule regarding the limitations on subcontracting, that was late December 2014. That rulemaking came out, really primarily geared towards set-aside contracts, but they did put in a few provisions, proposed provisions related to the subcontracting plan requirements. So we've listed them here for you. These are things that are possibly coming down the pike. The SBA might finalize this rule later in 2015, but probably more likely into 2016. And I think what's maybe the most interesting on here is, to me anyway, the potential penalties for not providing a written corrective action plan or demonstrating good faith effort to comply with a written corrective action plan. The penalties could include material breach of contract, and that it must be considered in any past performance evaluation. So, and what we're referring to here is if you are not doing such a great job on your subcontracting plan, the SBA might require you to enter into a written corrective action plan. So they want a hammer to be able to swing to make you enter into that plan and live up to it. So these penalties would be that hammer, but it just goes back to a point now we're harping on it, that this is an SBA regulation. And how is the SBA going to enforce a rule that says failure to comply with the plan is material breach of contract? Because in the FAR, it says SBA is not authorized to exercise any authority regarding the administration of individual prime contracts or subcontracts. So how do we marry these two up then? That the SBA proposing to say they want to be able to state that a contract is materially breached if the prime doesn't live up to its corrective action plan, but yet the SBA doesn't have authority regarding administration of individual prime contracts. Well, I think what they're proposing to do here is really that they would make a recommendation to the contracting officer that SBA, based on SBA's review, they don't believe that the prime has made a good faith effort to comply with its written corrective action plan, and so they recommend to the contracting officer that that should be treated as a material breach of contract. And I think that's probably as far as the SBA's authority. They could extend their authority, and then it would be up to the contracting officer whether or not to adopt the SBA's recommendation. And I'd be curious to get feedback from the SBA and other government folks who are on the line here, like to the extent to which, you know, there are issues in contracting officers adopting SBA's recommendations. And I know we don't have this particular recommendation yet because this is still a proposed rule, but you know, there's a potential inconsistency there in the between the review and evaluation and enforcement. And that's a good segue into our next section, which is to discuss the SBA review process. And I'm going to turn it over to Katie.
So just a quick overview of the SBA review process. And as John said, SBA will be reviewing to evaluate your compliance with the plan requirements, but it's the agency that ultimately is going to enforce your compliance with these requirements. Generally speaking, we've seen a great uptick in the number of audits and compliance reviews by the SBA. From our perspective, SBA in general is just increasing the amount of frequency of which they audit their auditing activities. These reviews will be performed by regional SBA offices through either the procurement center representatives, which we'll call the PCRs, and the commercial market representatives, or the CMRs. And during the review process, individual agencies can also participate in reviewing the contractor's particular compliance. And in that vein, DCMA may also get involved to audit the actual financial information in the numbers. There's 4 types of SBA reviews. The first is the one we're going to focus on today is the Subcontracting Program Compliance Review. And this is the comprehensive review of the contractor's total subcontracting program. And so that's where basically you'll get the CMRs will come in, have a site visit, review all your documentation, your figures, your methodologies, and really dig in and see whether or not you're complying with your program and your objectives. The second type of review is a performance review, and that is a lighter scale review. It focuses on the subcontracting achievement on a contract-by-contract basis via your reporting systems. So that's basically seeing whether the electronic reporting requirements are being met and whether or not you're hitting your goals that way. The third type of review is the Subcontracting Orientation and Assistance Review, or SOAR. And this is, I think this is more of an informational review. This is where you can work with SBA to set your subcontracting plan goals and requirements and go through, and SBA will give you advice and tools so you can evaluate your own subcontracting goals and get set to work through those. And then there's also follow-up reviews, which focuses on your implementation of previous SBA recommendations and whether or not you're utilizing the referred resources that SBA has given you. So we're going to walk you through right now a typical compliance review. And as we said, this is the type of review we're seeing more and more, and this is the one where you're going to have to provide more information and documentation to the SBA. And it requires quite a bit of prep time and seriousness. You have to approach these very seriously to see whether or not you're meeting your goals. So usually the process begins with a letter from SBA specifying a date of the SBA's planned visit to your office. So they will make a site visit. The SBA's letter will request that you submit the following lists approximately 1 week before the visit. They want to see a list of all the subcontracts to small businesses that you've made within the past year, all subcontracts to large businesses over $150,000 within the last year, and they want to see all your blanket purchase agreements entered into within the last year. And basically from this information, they're going to try to create a sample set of data from each list so they can evaluate how you're meeting your goals and requirements. And this becomes a little bit more complex on the commercial plan side than for individual plans. Individual plans, you might only have 3 subcontracts for that particular contract, and so it's easy to produce those to the SBA. But if you're a large business or a very large business and you've got a commercial item plan, you've got thousands of purchase orders that you make with various vendors. That's going to, for all of those contracts and items, the SBA is going to go through and try to pick up a sample set. So that's where it becomes a little bit more complicated.
Thanks, Katie. Another part of the compliance review prep is that they'll probably ask you to complete a checklist, and this checklist has a number of questions geared toward fleshing out your program and your goal performance, what your historical trends have been over the last 5 years, what you're doing to outreach to small businesses and success stories. They're going to ask you about your SBLO and your SBLO's responsibilities. And they want a number of supporting documents to go along with those checklist responses. So and some of the documents they're going to likely ask you for are listed below here. Some reviewers will like to see that information in advance of coming to the office. Others will tell you to have it ready when they come in to visit with you, but this is just a further example of the information that you need to pull together. And I think it goes to confirm what Katie said, which is, preparing for a compliance review is important, and it takes some work. It's not the kind of thing that you can expect to do overnight. So, and the success of the review, I think, is in large part driven by the preparation that you put into it, and getting a jump on it, and making sure you have all this information organized and easy for the SBA to get through really will make a big difference. So when they come to your office, it's be a day or so, maybe 2 days in some cases, but they'll likely want to meet with key stakeholders like your SBLO, maybe representatives from management, possibly buyers, and there'll be, the overall guidepost is whether you're making good faith efforts to comply with your plan. How is your plan working, and in particular, what's the methodology that you use in developing and reporting your goals and your performance against those goals? And, how reliable is the data you've been reporting, assuming you've been complying with your reporting requirements, which would be another part of the assessment they'll be making. And in addition or in conjunction with assessing the methodology, how's your record keeping? I mean, this is one of the biggest areas of concern for clients that we work with, when they're getting ready to go into one of these reviews, is, how much of the documents do they have to support their goals and their performance against the goals. So record keeping is really critical, and the SBA is going to be assessing that. And they'll be looking at flow down requirements, as we discussed, and it's nice to give them an overall sense of your commitment to the subcontracting program, including management support. And I think that's another element that they're looking at. In terms of possible outcomes, you may find out during the on-site review. You may get an idea of where they're going in terms of a potential rating if they conduct an exit briefing with you. Or if you don't find out during the on-site, you'll get a written report after the visit, maybe a few weeks, a month or so later, and they'll be giving you an adjectival rating, so outstanding or highly successful, all the way down to unsatisfactory, depending on their conclusions and the different areas that they were looking at. And the rating you get informs what happens next, because if you receive a marginal or an unacceptable rating, the SBA is going to require you to submit a corrective action plan. And that's I mentioned it earlier, that the SBA also now wants to impose, through proposed rulemaking, penalties for not submitting the written corrective action plan. But this is, and just note that this is a corrective action plan the contractor is expected to write. So the ball is in your court as the prime contractor to come up with a plan to address the shortcomings that SBA may find in your program if they give you a marginal or unacceptable rating. And you're likely to be subject to a follow-up visit if you've received a corrective action plan sooner than the typical next audit would be, so maybe just a matter of a few months later. And this report that the SBA will ultimately issue will go to the appropriate contracting officer, and that's where the recommendations we're talking about, the role of the SBA as evaluator and recommender in terms of the rating and whether that should result in a liquidated damages or a breach of contract or adverse past performance rating, things like that. I mean, that are within the purview of the contracting officer. The SBA would make recommendations to the contracting officer. Okay, so we've run through what the basic requirements are, and then how the SBA reviews subcontracting plans. And so now in the time that we have left, let's talk about best practices for a successful subcontracting program, things that we've seen, and I'd like to hear from you guys as well, questions or comments as we run through. How can we have a successful subcontracting program? And Katie mentioned this, but the first thing we'll pass along is to develop a realistic subcontracting plan. Don't have goals that you have no hope of meeting. It's a negotiation. Your goals should be not easy, but they should be attainable. So we have to strike a balance there. And I think we hear frequently that the model plan is what agencies push for, which is just the same percentages as applied to the federal government, 3% for HUBZone, 5% for STB, etc. But that might not make sense for you, based on your organization, what you buy, the availability of suppliers for what you need. So be mindful of that and shape your goals as realistically as you can. Goals should be based on total subcontract dollars, and we'd love to get more feedback from SBA on this. I mean that's how we read the regulations, that the goal should be based on total subcontract dollars. We've heard though that some agencies insist that the goals be based on total contract dollars. Now the SBA's regulation indicates that first and foremost the goals should be based on total subcontract dollars, but the contracting officer has discretion to impose set additional goals that are based on total contract dollars. So to me that would be additional goals beyond the baseline meat and potato goals that should be based on total subcontracting dollars. We shouldn't have all and only goals based on total contracting dollars, but we'd like to get your input on that. Limit responsibility for flow down and oversight of subcontracting plans. We've mentioned this. There is no flow down requirement for commercial items. So, develop your plan in a way that you're not over including who it is that you need to subcontract, that you need to flow down the requirements to at the subcontract level. And one of the portions of the subcontracting plan asks you to describe the steps that you're going to take to make a good faith effort to comply with the plan. Well, there's your opportunity to draw those steps narrowly as possible and as objectively measurable as possible. The more you get into squishy things that you'll do that are hard to quantify, the harder it's going to be after the fact to demonstrate clearly that you did take good faith efforts to comply. So we want to, as much as possible, make that list narrow and objectively measurable. The subcontracting base, this goes part and parcel with developing realistic goals, but what's included in your overall subcontracting base from which you are developing your percentage goals for small businesses. You don't want to over-include spending, which is going to make it harder for you to establish goals for small businesses that you have a realistic chance of meeting and that the government's going to accept. So one way you could look to narrow the subcontracting base is to exclude subcontracting that you can only do with large businesses. And that's you don't want to be too aggressive with that, because you may not realize certain subcontracting there actually is a small business out there that could provide it, but there's going to be some things like rail transportation where you just can't find a small business. There's no small business that supplies it. So I think there's a good argument for excluding that type of spending from your subcontracting base. There's also, clearly right in the regulations, you don't include subcontracting that's performed entirely overseas or intercompany transactions and lower tier subcontracts. There are also a lot of other exclusions listed in the regulations, and we've listed them here on the remainder of the slide. These are also authorized exclusions from your subcontracting base. So you just, when you're establishing that overall total subcontracting figure that you're using to then develop your goals, you want to make sure that you're not including these authorized exclusions.
Another good thing to have in place is a policies and procedures manual. The purpose of this, we think, is twofold. First, you want to have something that shows SBA that you know what you're doing when you're setting up your subcontracting plan and your base, but also you want everyone else in your organization to know what you're doing with your subcontracting plan. Part of good compliance with and setting up goals is that the organization as a whole knows what they're doing and what subcontracting plan goals are. This is an issue we can see with some of our clients where there's turnover in the company's corporate structure, and from year to year you don't know what the prior leaders in the company were doing, how they were calculating certain percentages, what they were including in the base. So if you have a robust policy and procedures manual, it just helps the company know what they need to do down the road. And generally your manual can address these points that we have below, but basically what your covered supplies and services are, who the SBLO is, and what their responsibilities are, periodic checks that you will make on evaluation of your program performance and compliance, specifications regarding your record-keeping procedures, how you're going to maintain your vendor list, and generally just how you're going to basically keep up with your plan compliance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's really, I think this, as Katie mentioned, this manual, it's really helpful to also demonstrate to SBA that you understand the requirements, that you know what you're doing, you're making a good faith effort to comply because you've got this robust manual that you can demonstrate to them that you understand what you're doing and what you need to do.
Some other documents that you need for your program, the vendor self-certification form. This is a document that we see there's a little bit of confusion over. We think that for contractors that participate in commercial plans, this is a document that you're going to need to spend some time both compiling and maintaining. You want to follow the SBA's sample format and ask vendors to represent their small business status for primary and any secondary NAICS codes. And you want to make sure that you get all the NAICS codes that they're going to be operating in, that you have representations from them that they're small under those codes or not. You want to require the vendors to update the form at least annually if you're participating in a commercial plan, and more often if the vendor undergoes a change in status. This is where you see a divergence in commercial plans and individual plans, because as we said before, individual plans are contract specific and good for the life of the contract. So at least theoretically, the representation the subcontractor made at the proposal level should last it through contract performance. But that's not the same for commercial plans because they're not contract specific. They're over your entire corporate body. So basically, if you're participating in a commercial plan and the SBA comes and has an audit, you want to make sure that you have something to show the SBA that that vendor was small on the date that that order was fulfilled. Basically, you want to put the onus on your vendors to update you on their size and status. You also need a subcontract justification sheet to go through the process of evaluating small business participation for each subcontract. You want a letter from your CEO or management, upper management, in supporting your program. And you also want standard terms and conditions that should address flow-down obligations and require vendors to represent size and socioeconomic status.
And sort of dovetailing with what Katie was just talking about, in the other documents page, the next slide here deals with vetting your small business vendors, and this is really critical that you have something in your file to substantiate that your small business supplier made a representation to you that they're a small business. You know, if you're on an individual subcontracting plan, that may be right in the subcontract. If you're on a commercial plan, it seems to get a little bit trickier. From our perspective, it'd be better to do that in the vendor self-certification form and then make a representation in like standard terms and conditions, make your subs represent to you in the standard terms and conditions that their vendor survey form on file with the company is current, accurate, and complete, or if they have SAM, their SAM is current, accurate, and complete. But you know, the bottom line is you need to have something in the file, and you know, that's not only because that's what the SBA is going to be looking for when they come to audit you to say, well, can we really rely on this data you've reported? You said you spent 3% on small businesses, but were they really small? Let me see the representations that you had from the small business vendors. That when they pick those 20 or 30 sample vendors, like Katie mentioned earlier, that's part of what they're gonna be looking for, is show us the file, show us the representation of size or status from those vendors. And we had a question here about, you know, what if a firm was small on the date they submitted their proposal, but they did not certify their size to the prime, and the prime is awarded the contract, and the small then becomes, the small business sub becomes other than small. Should the prime report that subcontract award as small? That's a very interesting question. I think the SBA would probably say no, because you didn't get a representation from them prior to the proposal, and it sounds like after contract award they became other than small. So, you know, if we had a way to feel comfortable that they were truly small on the date they submitted their proposal, then we could possibly say they're small for the life of the contract, and we're not concerned that they grew to be other than small later. But if we don't have anything in our file, you know, we'd have to look at that one. But that's, you know, that goes to the importance of getting the representation, because then you're in the position of maybe you have to decide the safest approach is to not count the spending on that vendor. Because you just don't have the documentation in your file that you need. For hub zone firms, you got to go even further than getting a representation from your subcontractor. You need to go and verify hub zone status in the SBA's Dynamic Small Business Search website. So, and NAICS codes. I mean, we're getting a little short on time, so we probably can't get too deeply into this issue, but it's one that I'd really love to get SBA's input on. The SBA's rules state that the prime contractor has to assign a NAICS code and a size standard to each subcontract, and then the prime contractor has the discretion in selecting the most appropriate code. And the goal here is to make sure we're correctly measuring the small business's representation. So if we say the small business has to give us a representation of size, well, what are they repping to? They're repping to the size standard that applies to the contract, and that's why the SBA wants the NAICS code and the size standard in the contract. That may work okay in many cases for individual subcontracting plans, but we've seen several instances where it doesn't work at all in the commercial plan setting, where there aren't vendor relationships tied to a specific government contract, and there are thousands of vendors potentially with thousands upon thousands of orders. And the way I read the reg, I think it's geared towards individual subcontracting plans. I think that's the way it was intended, but it applies to all plans. The reg itself doesn't say it's limited only to individual plans. So we'd like to see some guidance from SBA on this. This requirement is not in the FAR right now. And maybe this is something that's going to get into the FAR. So in terms of contractual requirements, right now, contractually, you're not required to assign a NAICS code and a size standard to every contract. But we know that's what the SBA would like to see, and at least for individual subcontracting plans, that may make sense. But we'd like to see some guidance from SBA or some input and frankly, some flexibility on how that can be applied and what alternatives there might be in the commercial plan setting. Just a couple remaining slides, and I don't know if we'll have enough time left for questions. We have a number of them we haven't answered, and I promise we're going to get to each of you after the presentation, but just want to touch on training and outreach because this is an often underutilized tool to help to show that you have a solid subcontracting program. I think it would go a long way with the SBA if you could document and demonstrate that you've done these things. And frankly, I think this is low-hanging fruit, to make sure internally that your people have awareness of the program, what the company's obligations are, and that the SBLO is in a position to make that happen, that she or he is supported enough within the organization and has the resources to make it happen. And you can get involved in conferences and trade associations. I think it goes a long way if you know what a PTAC is in an audit. If you can tell SBA you know what a PTAC is, and maybe you've even worked with one before, that you've used the ProNet database. And like I said before, documenting. I'm sure every prime contractor can tell a story of mentoring or some kind of a success with a small business vendor, but can you document it? Can we confirm that to SBA? That's important, and these are, I think, relatively easy things to do to really make a big difference with your program. And then lastly, being prepared for an audit. We've touched on this a few times. That you can't just expect to show up the day of the audit and knock it out of the park. That not only does SBA want you to submit information ahead of the audit, which is going to require you to do some gathering beforehand, but you really want to be prepared when they come the day of. And our perspective, Katie and I, when we work with firms, we like to tell the story and get out in front of potential issues. I look at the subcontracting plan audit the way I look at a lot of other audits and investigations that we work on here for government contractors. It's all through this lens of, is the contractor presently responsible? What are our circumstances today? And if we can demonstrate that we've taken some voluntary corrective actions because we self-assessed and realized we have some shortcomings and we could do better, that we demonstrate a willingness to take feedback and recommendations from the reviewer and a desire and a commitment to do better, I think that all of that goes a really long way to mitigating potential shortcomings, because chances are most firms are going to have at least some shortcomings when they're reviewed. So I think getting out in front of these issues is really important. Gathering everything neatly and organized. This just goes to advanced planning. It's not rocket science, but these are repetitive issues that we see, and I think that we've also experienced success in audit prep help for clients in these areas. That going through a mock audit is really useful too, I think. The SBA has a compliance handbook for the subcontracting program that lists sample questions that they're going to ask. We've also been brought in to draft questions geared towards a specific organization and kind of put them on the hot seat and in preparation for the on-site. But any kind of advanced planning like that, again, really goes a long way to be prepared and to have success. And don't be afraid to ask the SBA for help. That's really a big part of what they're there for in this process. So it does not have to be, and frankly, it often is not an adversarial process. It really isn't. I mean, we really think the SBA does a great job in these reviews in being open and sharing information, wanting to help. I mean, that's a big part of their role, like I said, and so I think part of being prepared for the audit is recognizing ways that you can ask for help in areas where you need to ask for help, and being prepared to do that. And last point here, and this probably goes without saying, but you should be cordial and cooperative. We wanted to always demonstrate a willingness to work with the auditors. That doesn't mean that you have to accept everything the auditor is suggesting, because the process should be a give and a take. And ultimately, we should be trying to gear a program that marries the requirements or the goals with the realities for your organization. And that does not mean a one-size-fits-all approach. So it should be a give and a take, but you approach it the right way, and I think it goes a long way. We got a lot of questions. Like I said, we're going to have to wrap up. The slides and the audio will be available afterwards. They're going to be emailed out, so you'll get that maybe later this afternoon, but tomorrow at the latest. We will email every one of you that sent a question. So we really appreciate all the good feedback. We incorporated some of the questions into our responses, and I know we answered some directly, but there's a lot we weren't able to get to. I promise we'll get to all of you in a few days, and we just really appreciate everybody taking the time to join us today. Thank you.